right. Hi, everyone. Welcome. Thank you for joining us, and welcome to the patrons from Wilmington, North Reading, Andover, and Tewksbury Public Libraries. We are in a Zoom webinar this evening, so audience members, you will not be seen on camera, but we do encourage you to participate by typing any questions you may have into the chat feature at the bottom of your screen. I'm so excited to welcome Ted Reinstein. Many of you will know him as a reporter from Chronicle, WCVB's Boston's award-winning nightly news magazine. He's also a regular contributor to the station's Political Roundtable, and he sits on WCVB's editorial board. Ted is also the author of several books, including his most recent, New England's General Stores, Exploring an American Classic. I'm looking forward to the virtual road trip he'll be taking us on tonight. I'm going to turn things over to Ted.
Erin, thank you very much for that lovely introduction. Thank you all for joining me out here tonight. Obviously, all of us wish that we were meeting up in person, but that's true for pretty much everything we do these days, or I should say don't do, from going to in-person live events at the library to meeting up for dinner somewhere, but hopefully soon this year. So thanks very much. Thank you both the Wilmington Public Library in Reading, North Andover, Tewksbury, all libraries that I have spoken at in person over the years. So nice to have you all kind of collaborating on this tonight, and I appreciate it. So tonight I'm going to talk to you about two new virtual talks. These are not related to my books, but rather two new virtual talks that I put together this past summer, because it occurred to me that public libraries, of which I count myself a huge devoted supporter, we're going to need some content to begin reprogramming and re-engaging patrons with events and so forth virtually. So this was one of the two talks that I developed over the summer, and it's kind of just a quick tour through New England and some of my very favorite stories, people, places, legends, and I'm going to share them with you. So as Erin said, if you have at any point during the talk, if you have some questions, you can put them in the chat, and then as soon as the talk is over in less than an hour, I will be happy to answer any questions anybody has. So I always like to start by saying, think of New England as like this iconic landmark restaurant, right? And you know, a place like that always has some signature dishes that they're famous for, right? That's what you bring people there. So I always say, like, what would be the signature dishes of New England, right? Well, obviously the ocean would be one of them. That'd be a huge one, right? Very famous for the ocean, very famous for the mountains. You know, New England is one of only two regions in the country, the Pacific Northwest and Northern California being the other, that has actual legitimate mountains that come down and meet the ocean, right? So very unique that way. And of course, history. I mean, New England is absolutely famous for history. We forget, we're used to it, we take it for granted, but people travel from all over the world, never mind all over the country, to come to New England and experience its history, right? And just like, to use that same metaphor of a famous restaurant, like signature dishes, you know, what would be signature side dishes, right, with a place like that? And in New England, I always think of that as, you know, being politics, sports, and actual seafood, right? An actual side dish that's an actual dish. New England, of course, famous throughout the world for its seafood. Now, in terms of the examples I gave here, if you know who that dapper gentleman in the fedora is, and you know that that's Boston's famous rogue mayor, James Michael Curley, good for you. If you know that number 6 on the Celtics is legendary Hall of Fame center Bill Russell, good. I assume you all know a lobster from a quahog, let's say, although it's not going to be lobster that we're going to be talking about in the early part of the talk here tonight. So speaking of food, which is never far, the subject of food is never far from my travels, so never far from my talks. You may know that in all my travels around New England, I very frequently, in fact, almost invariably, end up visiting at least a diner or two. New England, of course, the birthplace of the diner, and tonight, as a special little added attraction, call it dessert. When we're done with our quick little tour around New England, then I'm going to do a quick little lightning tour of my favorite diners in each of the states that we visit. So, our compass settings, where we're going tonight. Well, we are going to use Boston as our base. We're going to go north through the North Shore. We're going to continue north into Maine. Then we're going to go west into New Hampshire, further west into Vermont. Then we're going to dive south. We're going to re-enter Massachusetts through the Berkshires with a quick side jaunt through two of the states that are not part of the main tour, Rhode Island and Connecticut, not forgetting about them. But they're going to be a quick little side tour, a little detour, and then we'll finish up back in Boston. So, everybody comfortable? Feet up? Got a drink or two or food or snack or ready? Okay, so we're off. So I said first up will be the North Shore. I know something about the North Shore, probably more so than any other part of New England, mostly because I grew up on the near North Shore. Or I always consider Winthrop, where I grew up, and which I refer to lovingly as the charming little seaside town at the end of runway 27L. I always refer to it as the gateway to the North Shore. Winthrop is to the North Shore what Quincy is to the South Shore. In other words, the very, very beginning of their respective shores, right? And Winthrop, of course, is most famous, like it or not, for the fact that it is situated next to a huge international airport. So it was a noisy childhood. I had some fun with these little arrows here pointing to Winthrop. You can see the Highlands section of Winthrop, where I grew up, my home. I don't even know if that's actually pointing to my home, but it's pretty close to it. A plane in the air, because you will notice if you ever see a wide picture of Winthrop that shows like panoramic vision, kind of, the sky and the beach and the so forth, you will see a plane if you look closely enough, because they land every 18 to 21 seconds. So there's no photograph really of the sky and Winthrop that doesn't have a plane in it. And a field where I played baseball, which is in the Point Shirley section of Winthrop. And the Point Shirley section is right on the water, less than an eighth of a mile from the end of a major runway. So I always thought that when I was standing in the outfield in Point Shirley, that I could see people in the windows of the planes as they were landing. I think that probably is my boyhood imagination talking now, but they're pretty close. They're pretty close. And as you can see, there's the grid pattern of Logan's runway layout. And you could never, ever cite an international airport today that close to a very densely populated, relatively urban area. But it was 1920s. And the only planes landing at Edward F. Logan Airport were prop planes, mail planes, taking the mail to Philadelphia, New York. So they were not imagining the jumbo jets we have today. So on to now the real North Shore. One of my favorite places on the North Shore, mostly because I love pointing up the fact that New England, Massachusetts is in fact home to two capes, right? Cape Cod being only one of the capes in Massachusetts. But Cape Cod has just become synonymous with the Cape in Massachusetts. Literally, right? You say, I'm going to the Cape this weekend. Nobody says which Cape, right? But there are two Capes. And I love Cape Ann. I like Cape Cod. I love Cape Ann because it is the other Cape. It's less populated. It is less built up. It's less developed. Just as much history. In fact, its history goes back by over a century older than Cape Cod, not in terms of native population, mind you, who have been in both places for thousands of years, but in terms of European settlement only. And the funny thing about Cape Ann is that, just until the 1960s, 50s, late 50s, Cape Ann was an island. It was the building of the Abram Piet Andrews Jr. Bridge that literally connected Cape Ann, as you can see there, with the mainland and with Route 128. Until that point, it was an island. It has one major city. That's it, Gloucester, right? This photograph done by a wonderful longtime friend of mine, a great landscape photographer, Mark Canagas, native of Rockport, had for many years a gallery on Bearskin Neck there. This is one of his photographs of Rockport Harbor. Here's one of his photographs of famous motif number 1 sitting in Rockport Harbor. Funny thing about motif number 1, it's very, very, well, it was said to be at one time the single most painted and photographed landmark in America. I don't think that was ever true. although they do seem to think that up in Rockport. But it's very popular. I think it's what a lot of people think of. It's one of those places that people who aren't from New England think of when they think of New England, when they think of certainly Cape Ann. As you can see, it's on the cover of my first book, New England Notebook. So years ago, my friend Mark Canigis introduced me to a friend of his called Gussie Contrino. Gussie is a great, colorful character, longtime lobsterman out of Rockport Harbor. And years ago, Gussie and I were standing in Rockport Harbor, and I asked him, I want you to look at motif number 1, right? There is a white building that is directly behind motif number 1, right? And we're standing there. And I said to Gussie, Gussie, you'd be the perfect person to ask this. I said, what is that white building behind motif number 1? And without pausing for a beat, Gussie said, motif number 2. Any questions? Now, Halibut Point, I don't know if any of you have ever been there. It's a wonderful place up on Cape Ann, very near Rockport. And it is one of the 2 places in the continental United States that is the first to see the rising sun in the east, rising up over the horizon. One of 2 places, the other being Cape Porpoise in Maine. And Halibut Point is also right next door to one of my favorite spots, back to food, on Cape Ann, the Lobster Pool, which is really a wonderful place to see the sunset. I've been taking my kids there since before they could walk, but it is not lobster, ironically, that Cape Ann is famous for. I mentioned it was going to be something else. It is clam, not just clams, fried clams. Why is Cape Ann famous for fried clams? Easy. Cape Ann is said to be where the fried clam was invented. Just over 100 years ago, you probably have heard of Woodman's. Well, the guy who started it all, Chubby Woodman, and his wife, Bessie, are said to have invented the fried clam. Now, story goes like this. It's a hot summer day in July, 1916. And Chubby and Bessie have a little store, in Essex, and they sell clams. They sell all kinds of shellfish, shucked, unshucked, checked. And they also have a fryer in which Bessie cuts up thin slices of potato. So it's kind of their version of, take your pick, a potato chip or a French fry. So on this hot summer day, the story goes that a friend of theirs, an old fisherman, comes in and he's sitting there and he's watching Chubby shuck clams, and he's watching Bessie throw potatoes into the fryer. And at some point, apparently, he says to Chubby, he says, "Hey, Chub, what do you suppose would happen if you tossed a clam into the fryer?" And Chub says, "I don't know, never tried it. Let's find out." So he tosses a shucked clam into the fryer, and they fish it out, bite into it, and it was inedible, like rubber, right? Bessie, observing this and about to prove forevermore the maxim that behind every successful man, there's an even smarter woman, right? Takes the shucked clam, dredges it through the batter that she's been using for the potatoes, throws that into the fryer. They take that out. The rest is history. Delicious. And suddenly Woodman's has a brisk business in fried clams, which apparently didn't exist before that. So thank you, Bessie Woodman. And the rest is history, because now Cape Ann is probably more famous than any other place in New England for fried clams. You can get fried clams all over the place, but only in Cape Ann do they have a highway called the Clam Highway, which is Route 133. And do they have an actual thing called the Clam Wars, because of all the different places, particularly the 3 most famous clam places. Woodman's in Essex, Farnham's also in Essex, and over in Ipswich, the Clam Box. Truth of the matter is, there's no clam war. I have known the owners of all of these places, and they have told me, each of them, that they're all good friends. On a busy Saturday night, if one of them runs out of clams, they think nothing of sending a runner over to one or the other and getting a bushel of clams. So no big deal, no clam war, but it certainly makes for a lot of fun. Speaking of it that way, as this kind of rivalry. And of course, I don't know if you have a favorite, I like to eat at all three of them, and I like to be on good terms with all three of them. So I'm like Switzerland in the clam wars, right? I'm totally forever neutral. So we're out of the North Shore. We are now continuing further north. And you know, if you continue further north out of Massachusetts and New Hampshire, coast of New Hampshire into Maine, you are going what's called down east. Now, that doesn't make any sense to anybody else, anywhere else in the country, because if you're going up, how can you be going down, right? But down east, right, where the mountains truly meet the sea. So I love Maine. I love Maine. I love the coast of Maine. I love interior Maine. I'm going to share with you two of my favorite Maine factoids, okay? So you can impress your friends later. So one of them is very, well, they're actually both visible and evident from this picture, but one of them more than the other. So Maine, you may or may not know, is the only state in America that borders only one other state. Now, I think if Mainers could have their way, they just as soon not border any other state, but that would, of course, make Maine Hawaii. So that wouldn't really work. But the other factoid is a little bit less evident, but even more amazing. Okay. So think about the ragged and rocky coast of Maine. Think about if you're driving up the coast of Maine on Route 1, right? And you got to thread all in and out of all those little inlets, all those little harbors, all those islands, all right. You're going forever. I mean, if you drive from Boston and you cross over through New Hampshire into Kittery, and you continue up, right, threading along the coast, through the Yorks, through the Berwicks, through the Kennebunks, you finally, after 2.5 hours, get to Portland. 2.5 hours more, maybe you're in Bar Harbor. 3.5 hours more, you're in Eastport. 5.5 hours more, you're up at the top of Maine. It can take you easily 8.5, 9 hours to drive along all the way up the coast of Maine. It's a long way. If you were to fly over the coast of Maine, say Boston, take off in Logan, you fly to Eastport, you're still doing 475 miles. Okay, might take you 35, 40 minutes. That's a little quicker. But the point is, if you could straighten out the coast of Maine, you know what you get? So think of it as like this balled up piece of twine, and you could straighten it out magically into a straight line. Know what you get? Well, you're looking at the answer. 3,000 miles. In other words, from Boston to San Francisco. But that is my favorite Maine factoid. But here's the thing, you know, Maine has so many places along the coast that really stand out, that really are in some ways a favorite of mine. But I'm going to share one with you because I love playing a little game of where are we? Okay, so where are we? Anybody know? Lighthouse look familiar? Good reason. Good reason. That lighthouse was a very popular design of the 19th century. A lot of lighthouses built. It was very economical, very practical. So you'll find lighthouses that look like that in Falmouth, Nobska, right, on Cape Cod, the Nubble in Maine, even a shortened version of Boston Light, right? A little shorter. Very, very similar. Very similar. It is none of those. Here's a hint. It's on Muscongas Bay. Got it now? It is Pemaquid Point. It is Pemaquid Point. Pemaquid Point sits in the mid-coast area of Maine, Brunswick, Topsom, Wiscasset, right? So you'd be driving up Route 1, you'd get to Brunswick, and before you cross the river over into Topsom, you would take a right turn. You drive south 21 miles. When you get to the end of the road, this is what you'd be looking at in the town of Bristol. You'd be looking out at the lighthouse. But it's not the lighthouse, the front there, that has always drawn me to Pemaquid Point. It's what's behind the lighthouse. I always feel like Pemaquid represents what I see in my mind's eye when I think about that ragged and rocky coast of Maine. You've got this almost 6.5 acres of these very unusual striated rocks. The tide coming in or out doesn't matter. It's just beautiful. It's beautiful in any weather. It's beautiful any time of day, any season. I've always loved Pemaquid Point. Now, chowder, anyone? You're beginning to see, I think, that food is never far from my mind as I travel. But there's a reason why I picked Pemaquid also, because it's also near something very special to me. So for years and years, going back 20 years or so, I always had this personal quest in my travels. I love all kinds of food, but I particularly love seafood, and I particularly love clam chowder. So I started this quest many, many years ago to see if I could find the best clam chowder in New England. Now, I think on some level, I didn't really mind if I actually succeeded in my quest, because what could be better than continually having to try clam chowder everywhere? However, I did find the best chowder in New England. I did. And I found it in Midcoast, Maine. I found it in Brunswick, Maine, little part of Brunswick called Buttermilk Cove, and in a place that is even more unlikely than the fact that it would have been Little Buttermilk Cove, because it's not a place you would ever have thought of to look for the best clam chowder in New England. It's a place called the Gwinnett Trading Company. And if you didn't know they serve seafood, really nothing would suggest to you that they do, right? I mean, I always think the Gwinnett Trading Company, I mean, they could sell scented candles, right? They could sell moccasins, I mean, footwear, anything, right? But it was a long time, tiny little 2-car auto repair garage, right? And about 15 years ago, wonderful couple, Julie and Brian Soper, both commercial fishermen. Brian is still a commercial scalloper. Julia decided she wanted to get off the water, loved to cook, and decided she wanted to open up her own place. So she did. She did. And they make all kinds of stuff. They're all fresh seafood. How fresh? Well, I always point out that Brian is still a commercial scalloper. So on any given day, he may be out scalloping 5, 6 o'clock in the morning. By 10 o'clock, he might be swinging by the store to drop off a bushel of fresh scallops. So by 11:30, you could order scallops for lunch that were literally sitting on the ocean floor 60 minutes earlier. That's fresh. That's fresh. But it wasn't scallops I ordered the first time I was there about 8, 9 years ago. I was with my longtime Chronicle photographer, Carl Vieira, and Carl and I ordered, I believe we ordered the same thing, which wasn't unusual. I think we ordered like a tuna roll and a bowl of chowder. Well, the chowder came out first, and I took one spoonful of the chowder. And look, I'm not saying that like I heard like heavenly music, you know, but close to it. I took one spoonful and I said to Carl, I said, taste this. I don't know what it was, but it was very clear this was the best bowl of clam chowder I ever tasted. Within minutes, I told Julie to hold the tuna roll, and I would order a second bowl of clam chowder. The last time I was there about 3 years ago, same deal, 2 bowls of clam chowder. I barely could walk out of there. And Julie was nice enough to leave me with a quart of clam chowder to take with me. So now you know where to go to get the best clam chowder in New England. So now we are out of Maine, and now we are heading west rather than north. And if you go out through the western mountains of Maine, cross the border into New Hampshire, you're in the White Mountains of New Hampshire. And I figured, why not start at the very top? Why not start at not only the top of New Hampshire, but the roof of New England itself, Mount Washington, just under 6,300 feet. Mount Washington is yes, that is me standing there like an idiot without a hat. Mount Washington is a storied mountain, not only in New England, not only in America, but all the world. Mount Washington said to have some of the worst weather in all the world, highest wind speeds ever recorded on the face of the earth, Mount Washington. But I want to talk about one particular facet of Mount Washington, and it's a way that you might relate to Mount Washington. Many people do who have never hiked it. I have hiked Mount Washington. I have skied on Mount Washington, but I have also driven up, like maybe some of you, on Mount Washington, the famous Auto Road. The Auto Road, which, believe it or not, was built before the Civil War. I've only driven it, I think, once as a kid, and then once about 6, 7 years ago with my Chronicle photographer, Carl Vieira. Now, the reason why I love to relate this story is because it was just a very unusual experience. So I'm going to tell this story partly at Carl's expense. So he's smiling in that photograph. There we are that very day, because we had been doing a story down below the summit at Pinkham Notch, and it was so unusually clear that we decided, why not drive up because you very rarely get a day. Some clouds had rolled in that picture, but it really was very clear, sunny, and it was just so unusual. We said, look, let's get up there and get some pictures because this is so unusual. So we did. So there we are at summit. Carl is smiling. He was not smiling about 25 minutes earlier. So we had started driving up the auto road, and we gotten up about 2,200 foot level, right? So about 25 minutes in. And it was very clear to me that Carl was not doing well, that he was in distress. So I said to him, I said, what, are you okay? What's up? Not a place you want to sort of not be doing well behind the wheel, right? You got some huge steep drop-offs, no guardrails. Well, it turns out that was the problem. So Carl confided to me, confessed might be a better word, that he had a phobia that I was not aware of, which is unusual if it had anything to do with being in any kind of a vehicle or conveyance of any kind, because Carl and I have been in virtually anything you could think of. Everything you can think of in the air, from a hot air balloon to a helicopter to every kind of plane to a glider, hang glider, you name it. Everything on the water, under the water. So I couldn't figure out what was bothering him, but it turns out that Carl's phobia was exactly that. It was a phobia of riding on a high mountain road with steep drop-offs and no guardrails. I don't know what the term for it is, but he had it. And he had to pull over and hold up a few cars while it looked like a fire drill, right? While I jumped out and took the wheel, and Carl put that red jacket over his head so that he couldn't see, and we got on up to the top where, yes, he was smiling. So Carl knows that I love to relate this story. He just doesn't know how often and to how many people I relate it. So on to a different mountain, and a whole other story. So you are looking at Profile Lake, and you may know that Profile Lake takes its name from reflecting the profile of New Hampshire's most famous resident. Gone now, but nonetheless, New Hampshire's most famous resident, who for who knows how long, the millennia, towered above Franconia Notch. And we're talking, of course, about the Old Man of the Mountain. The Old Man of the Mountain is, without any question, New Hampshire's most famous landmark, even though he's gone, right? The Old Man of the Mountain still graces the New Hampshire highway signs, still graces the New Hampshire state license plate, and for hundreds of years, really, in many, many ways, summed up New Hampshire, was the face, literally, of New Hampshire. There's an old daguerreotype, old black and white photos and postcards and so forth. What made the Old Man of the Mountain, of course, so amazing was the fact that it was something that you had to see, right? It wasn't something you could easily describe. And when you did see it, it presented itself to view in a manner of seconds. And then usually if you're driving by, then it was gone, right? And the reason that was the case, as we all know, was that the Old Man of the Mountain was not one single rock outcropping. It was made up of about 7 different rock outcroppings that, taken together, if you stood at just the right angle and looked up at just the right moment, you saw it, right? But here's the thing. The Old Man was created because other rocks on the cliffs of Cannon Mountain had fallen, right? As other rocks over the eons fell, that created what we call the Old Stone Face. But people knew, experts knew, geologists knew, they knew that the Old Man, the rock face, that was going to fall too. All the rocks on the cliffs were going to fall someday. There was no way around it. But what we didn't see from the ground was that for hundreds of years, or at least the last 100 anyway, what we didn't see was that people had really worked hard to kind of preserve the Old Man, to give it a chance, to shore it up, support it, buttress it, and see if they could keep it in place for another decade, 2 decades, whatever, right? From the ground, you didn't see the huge steel turnbuckles, the cables, right? The concrete that they had put in between the cracks and the rocks. And it worked. It worked for easily the past 100 years. We know that the old man was there for at least 200, 300 years. Native Americans referred to it going back 300, 400 years. How long was it created before that? We don't know. What we do know is he's gone. He's gone because on May 3rd, 2003, about 1:30 in the morning, the old man came down. It really had been ordained, but it had been a kind of perfect storm that finally brought the old man down. It was a very warm spring, late April, early May. Temperature up in Franconia Notch got up a couple of days in there over 70 degrees. That's extraordinarily warm for early spring in the White Mountains. There had been some torrential rains. A lot of water had built up in the crevices and the cracks of the rocks. And then on May 2nd, a cold front came through. The temperature dropped over 40 degrees in 24 hours, dropped below freezing. You know what happens to ice when it freezes? It expands. And that's what it did. And about 1:30 in the morning, the old man came down. And people were devastated. People were devastated. I always say perhaps none more so than a guy I always referred to as the other old man of the mountain. My late friend, the wonderful Dick Hamilton. Dick was a legend up in the White Mountains. Dick was the head of tourism for many, many years in the White Mountains. His office was just south of the old man in Woodstock, New Hampshire, and his home was just north of the Notch in Littleton. So Dick had to drive through the Notch twice a day. And, he told me once that every night as he used to drive home north along 93, he'd look up and he'd say, I know who my boss really was. And he doesn't write the checks, he'd say, but he makes it possible for there to be money to write the checks, the old man. And he'd say, good night, old man. And on his way home, and Dick was devastated when the old man fell, and everybody knew how attached to the old man and with that area Dick Hamilton was. So the governor of New Hampshire at that time appointed Dick Hamilton to head up a commission that was going to look at how best to commemorate the old man, how best to memorialize the old man of the mountain. And there were many suggestions, many proposals, some of them outlandish, some of them I'm so glad were not chosen. For instance, there was a proposal to create a concrete replica of the old man up in exactly the same place. I'm so glad that did not happen. But what did happen is Dick Hamilton was in the position of choosing the best proposal, and he did. He did. It was a proposal by a wonderful, ingeniously creative toy designer from Newburyport, Massachusetts, Ron Magers. And Ron's proposal was ingenious because not only did it allow for a way to see how the old man looked when he was still up on Cannon Mountain, he also created a way to replicate the experience of how you saw the old man, right? Which was to get yourself in that right position for just a moment so that all those 7 separate rock faces lined up. And Ron called what he came up with the profilers. And today there are now half a dozen profilers in place on Profile Lake to look up at the old man, and they are ingenious. So think of it this way. The profilers are what look like, as you can see, it looks like an inverted hockey stick, right? But at the end of the blade of one of those hockey sticks are in miniature, the 7 slavishly redesigned and recreated 7 separate rock facings that made up the old man, right? So what you do is you get yourself, as that couple is doing, behind one of those profilers, and you look up where it's near the old man, and you get yourself in the right position. I'm going to hold my mini profiler up here so you can see what I'm talking about. See? Do you see along the profiler, there are the 7 miniature rock outcroppings that make up the old man. And what you do is you turn and get behind the profiler, and then you look up. And by doing that, I can never quite recreate this in my camera, but by doing that, I think you get the idea. By doing that, you see the old man. People have stood there and said, oh my God, it's like he's there again. It's just a wonderful, wonderful way and so ingenious of Ron Magers to think of that. So before we leave New Hampshire, I do want to share with you another favorite spot of mine in New Hampshire, because it's home, this one spot along this larger spot, it's home to two of my favorite people in New Hampshire. So I'm talking about Route 4 between, say, Dover, New Hampshire, and Chichester, Rochester, the traffic circle at Epsom, otherwise known as Antique Alley, right? At one time, sadly not anymore, but at one time, it had the highest concentration of antique stores anywhere in America. I'm not a huge antique nut, but in Northwood, New Hampshire, I do have a favorite antique store, mostly because it's run by one of my favorite New Hampshire people, Charlie Yetton. Charlie Yetton has an antique store called the Betty House in Northwood. And Charlie's funny. He loves politics. He's a retired state school superintendent and also a retired state senator. Loves politics and also loves refinishing old wooden chairs. So if you're looking for, say, a butter churn or an antique radio, the Betty House may not be your place. But if you're looking for an antique political poster or an antique chair, you got to go to the Betty House, because that's pretty much all Charlie Yetton sells. But Northwood is also home to another favorite New Englander of mine, perhaps the funniest New Englander I've ever met, Becky Rule. Becky is a writer, prolific author, has written many books about New Hampshire, New England. About 10 years ago, maybe a little bit less than that, she published a book called Headin' for the Rhubarb, which was a compendium, sort of a glossary of New England terms, right? And so I thought, when I met Becky, she would be the perfect person to ask one of my favorite questions, because it's always bothered me that I have met over the years in my travels around New England. I have met New Englanders who I have assumed have been a native of the town that I've been in, right? Like, my favorite example is, I was once sitting at the counter at Moody's Diner in Waldoboro, Maine, and I'm sitting next to this guy, elderly gentleman, and looks like, if you looked up old time Mainer, this guy's picture would be there. And when he opened his mouth, if there was audio of an old time Mainer in the dictionary, it would be his, right? I said, how you doing? He was like, very good, sir. How you doing? I said, good. I said, I take it you're a native? And he said, no, sir. I said, you're not? So it turns out he was 98 years old. I said, you're not a native? He said, no, sir. I said, well, you weren't born in Maine? No, sir. I said, where were you born? He said, I was born in New Jersey. I said, well, when did you come to Maine? He said, when I was 6 months. So I said, this is ridiculous that this gentleman doesn't think of himself as a native. So I said to Becky Rule, I said, Becky, when do you think somebody actually becomes a native in New England, considering they may have lived there for 9 decades? And she had a perfect answer. And here it is. She said, you become a native in an old New England town when the last person in that town who knows when you move there dies. Congratulations, you're a native. Becky Rule. Told you she was funny. So we're done in New Hampshire. We are now heading as far west as we're going to go in New England, and indeed as far west as you can go, Vermont. So now we're in the Green Mountains of Vermont. There's Route 100, gorgeous stretch of highway in Vermont. So I like to point out, well, let's do two things. Let's start with Vermont's highest peak and also Vermont's own rock profile face. Okay. So you're looking at Mount Mansfield, highest point in Vermont, just under 4,400 feet. Stowe, Vermont, very famous ski area. And where I try to go once a year. So here's the interesting thing. Mount Mansfield also claims an old stone face. Can you see it? I'll give you a hint. This face is lying down. Can you see it? So easier to see in the fall, not the winter or the summer. So do you see it now? So it's like it's called the old man lying down, looking up at the sky. See, it's got a forehead, got a nose, got an upper lip, lower lip, chin, even throws in an Adam's apple there, right? Well, the truth of the matter is, how about now if I flip it? Can you see it now? Not so much. No. I always say that the old stone face on Mount Mansfield really succeeds in nothing so much as making you just miss the old man of the mountain that much more. Maybe you agree. However, speaking of skiing, so last year, 2020, nobody was happier than, well, let's just say everybody was equally happy to bid good riddance to 2020. However, this was sort of a great day that I had in 2020, but before the pandemic really descended. So just about 1 year ago, I headed up to Orange County, Vermont to do some stories for Chronicle. Now, I've been skiing all my life. And so somebody must have said to me, I don't remember who it was, but somebody said, listen, I know you love to ski and I know you don't like those big, expensive ski resorts that get all crowded. And that's true. I don't. So they said, you got to check out Northeast Slopes in East Corinth, Vermont. So I said, sure, I'll check it out. Was so glad that I did. So it does sit in East Corinth, Vermont. And what makes Northeast Slopes such a wonderful, extraordinarily rare place is that it is, well, first of all, it harks back to skiing decades ago, both in terms of the feel about it and the fact that it's not really developed and the fact that nobody's getting rich at Northeast Slopes. How much so? Nobody makes a dime at Northeast Slopes. Northeast Slopes is that rarity of rarity in skiing today. It is owned by volunteers. It is owned by the community, East Corinth, and it is open to everybody in the area. You know, there's a lot of, I'm not saying that there isn't a lot of history here because it's been around a long time. All volunteer run, always has been. And a lot of history, been here since the 30s. It's rope tow, very famous. It's rope tow today is now the oldest continuously operating ski lift in North America. Kids ski for free, all from the surrounding area. You know, there's a lot of low-income families in that area of Vermont. So kids all just ski for free, period. At Northeast Slopes, they all come there once a week anyway with their schools for their gym class, and all the equipment is donated, and nobody makes a dime. So how inexpensive is Northeast Slopes, and how wonderful is it that it's all volunteer run, and how rare is it in today's ski world? Let me put it this way. If you went out to a big ski resort, right, in the east, someplace like Killington or Stowe, if you go out west, someplace like Sun Valley in Utah, you know, or Vail or Aspen in Colorado, these days you will pay a minimum of $100 just for a lift ticket. And then let's say you go in to get a sandwich for lunch. And if you're not alone, if you've got a couple of kids with you, right, let's say there's 4 of you, you're going to spend easily $100 for lunch, right? So I have one word for how expensive that makes skiing: obscene. And I try not to do it. I do take my kids for one ski trip every year up to Vermont. But other than that, I really don't like these kinds of places. What I love to ski. What I don't like is that the business of skiing, the industry of skiing, has made it so that a vast majority of people simply can't afford it. And that's not okay with me. But this day was wonderful. This day, I spent $16 for a day of skiing. I spent $10 for a half-day lift ticket, and I spent another $6 for Northeast Slopes signature Nor'easter burger, and it's one of the best days I've ever had. Now, we're done in Vermont. We're heading back south. We're going to re-enter Massachusetts through the Berkshires, right? And I always think that people feel kind of think of two things often when they think of the Berkshires. They think of Stockbridge, and that makes them think of Norman Rockwell, which makes perfect sense because it's kind of a circle that always keeps completing itself. Norman Rockwell lived in Stockbridge, Massachusetts, the last 20 years of his life. That famous painting of his is done, of course. Well, that's Norman Rockwell's one of his most famous paintings of Stockbridge. That black and white photograph of Norman Rockwell is at work there in his studio in Stockbridge. And there in the red little, that picture there at the red building, that is Norman Rockwell's studio. That is now on the grounds of the Norman Rockwell Museum. So maybe some of you have been there. When people think about Rockwell, I often think they think of two things. They think of the fact that Rockwell was obviously this incredibly gifted illustrator, his Saturday Evening Post covers, right? And they think of the fact that he was very famous for his models in his illustrations, right? His paintings, because Rockwell always worked from real life models. And that was true of almost every work he ever did. I think a lot of people are not as aware that the last 20 years of Rockwell's life in Stockbridge, he turned his talents, not entirely, but often, to dealing with some of America's social issues. And the social issue that really stayed largely for Rockwell a passionate issue was the issue of race in America, right? For instance, in 1964, Rockwell painted one of his most famous paintings, one of his most moving paintings, called The Problem We All Live With, because the problem we all lived with, to Rockwell's mind, was racism. And he was right. And in this particular painting of a very courageous 8-year-old girl, young Ruby Bridges, who is about to follow 2 U.S. Marshals into a segregated public school in New Orleans, Louisiana, and segregated. So a famous painting. In 1967, similarly, Rockwell was commissioned by Life magazine. He was commissioned by Life magazine to create the cover of a special edition they were doing on race in America. And it was about one particular facet of race in America. It was about the desegregation of America's suburban neighborhoods. Real life neighborhood, Rockville, Illinois, families of color moving in. And I want to draw your attention. So these were all models, all people who lived in Stockbridge in 1967, including, as far as I know, the dog. But I want to draw your attention to the young African-American gentleman on that one side there in the white sweatshirt, holding a baseball glove, right? Standing by his younger sister, who in real life was his cousin, also modeled for Rockwell. So here's a tighter inset of that young gentleman. His name was Ray Gunn. How great a name is Ray Gunn? WRAYGUNN. So how did he come to model for Norman Rockwell? There were not a lot of families of color living in Stockbridge, Massachusetts in 1967. Aren't a lot of families of color living in Stockbridge today, but even fewer then. So Ray Gunn's grandfather was a good friend of Norman Rockwell. They had become friends, and at the end of the day, very frequently, Ray Gunn's grandfather would go over to Norman Rockwell's studio and they would smoke their pipes and talk about the day, have a drink or two. And it must have happened that in 1967, Ray Gunn's grandfather told Norman Rockwell about this commission he was doing. And Ray Gunn's grandfather must have said, my grandson would be perfect to model for you. He's 12. You're looking for a 13-year-old. And he did. And he modeled for Norman Rockwell in 1967. He was 13 years old when he finished modeling for Norman Rockwell. No longer 13 when I met Ray Gunn in 2004. There he is. And at that point, he was giving tours of the Norman Rockwell Museum. And, I asked Ray Gunn, I asked him that day that we met up, and I asked him, I said, Ray, how does it feel? How does it feel to be working? Because he gave these tours. And I said, you come to work every day and you walk by a world famous painting and you're in it. How does that feel? And he looked at me just like that. And he said, I don't know. He said, I guess it's nice to know there's some place in the world where you'll forever be 13. And ain't that the truth? And Ray Gunn is in a chapter in my first book, New England Notebook, appropriately called Forever 13. No, we're heading back to Boston, heading east, heading home. But remember, I said I was not going to leave out. We've covered 4 states. I said I was not going to leave out the 2 states that we're not spending much time in, and I won't. So we're going to do a quick dive south, right, on our way back to Boston, because after all, what about Connecticut and Rhode Island? So I love Rhode Island. I also devoted an entire chapter in my first book to Rhode Island. The title of that chapter is Who You Callin' Small? Because Rhode Island may be the smallest state in America, but there's nothing small about the level of pride and ownership that Rhode Islanders feel for their small state. If you've ever wondered how many times would Rhode Island fit into Texas, I've done the work for you. 221 times. But for all of Texas, Texas is a state. Here's the thing. If you're really big, right, why boast about it? The Texans have never learned that. I've been to Texas many times. They've never learned that. They love to boast about it, which to me only endears me even less to Texas. So, there are lots of things in Texas you will not find, not just palm trees, but you won't find Rhode Island style calamari. You'll only find that in Rhode Island, Massachusetts, New York to some extent, right? You won't find a coffee cabinet. Do you know what a coffee cabinet is? So Rhode Island has some of their own language, right? A lot of their own terms, like a coffee cabinet, which is basically a coffee shake made with coffee syrup. And the best place to find that in all of Rhode Island is at Delecta's Pharmacy, which you will find in Warren, Rhode Island. Warren, Rhode Island, you may or may not know, has the distinction of being the smallest town in the smallest county in the smallest state in America. Smallest town by size, not population. But Texans like to say, who you calling small? Don't mess with Texas. Right. Rhode Island would say, who you calling small? I wouldn't mess with Rhode Islanders either all that much. And Connecticut, love Connecticut. In fact, in my last book, Wicked Pissed, which is all about some of New England's most famous feud, the biggest feud that I devote most of the book to is a feud that is in Bridgeport, Connecticut. But if you think of Connecticut, one word that I think should sum up Connecticut for you, if it doesn't already, pizza. Never far from food. I warned you. Pizza. I think you will find the best pizza in America. I would argue that it's possible you'll find the best pizza in the world in Connecticut. And I've eaten pizza all over the world, including all over Italy. But the truth of the matter is, New Haven is like the best place in America to find great pizza. Why? Because two of the best places that make pizza in all of America are on the same street in New Haven, Connecticut, Worcester Street. And they should be, because they were at one time related, right? So Frank Pepe started up his place on Worcester Street in the 1930s, and then his nephew, Sally Consiglio, started up his. So it was a rivalry for a little while. Today, they're all good friends. There's a picture of Bobby Consiglio still working the original brick oven at Sally's. I'm a Sally's guy, but pizza's awfully good from Pepe's too. So now we are truly back in Boston. And I did promise you, back to food, I did promise you, I always say to people, it's a wonder I don't weigh 400 pounds, honest to God. But I did promise you we would do a quick lightning round, and I would tell you what my favorite diners are. So we started on the North Shore. Got to go with the Agawam Diner. I love pies. I love banana cream pie, and nobody makes a better banana cream pie anywhere I've ever been than the Agawam Diner. In Maine, I mentioned Moody's in Waldoboro, Maine. Moody's is just the most wonderful, quintessential old New England diner. If you ever get your hands on that cookbook, What's Cooking at Moody's, I would suggest trying out a few recipes from there. In Biddeford, Maine, I love the Palace Diner. I love the Palace Diner because it represents the best diner of all to me, which is a diner that has been saved, that has been reopened. Two guys, wonderful foodies out of Portland, Maine, couldn't afford to open a restaurant in Portland. So instead they reopened a diner in Biddeford. And the Palace is just a wonderful place. In New Hampshire, the diner that combines my love of both diner food and politics, the Red Arrow in Manchester, New Hampshire. What a wonderful history. It's still the case today that if you're running for president, you cannot not stop in at the Red Arrow. And indeed, there you see former President Barack Obama chatting up some folks at the Red Arrow. In Vermont, I also have to go with two diners. And one of them is a reopened diner, which is why I love it. The Chelsea Royal in West Brattleboro, Vermont, what I love about it, partly great place, but also great sign. Is there ever been a better diner sign than the Royal Diner? And in Chester, Vermont, the Country Girl also represents one couple's dream of opening a diner. They always wanted to. They did. God bless them. That's the Country Girl in Chester. And as we come back toward Boston to finish for good, my favorite diner, the Boulevard. The Boulevard, you know, when people find or stumble upon or find or go or have a favorite classic diner, it's all the more classic if it's what's called an official Worcester dining car, because the diner was invented in Worcester. And so if a diner was made in Worcester, it will have a little medallion in the diner somewhere that has a number that proves it's an official Worcester dining car. It doesn't get more official than the Boulevard Diner on Shrewsbury Street in Worcester, because the Boulevard Diner sits about an eighth of a mile from where it was made. So, and it also has the most wonderful diner sign. In some ways, even more wonderful, because that just says it all, right? It doesn't have a name. It doesn't have hours. It doesn't say whether breakfast is served all day. It just says diner. Come in. The lights are on. It's warm. It's welcoming. And as we finish up back in Boston, some other lights we're looking forward to being back on at Fenway Park. Warm, welcoming, safe at home. And I certainly hope that over the next year, we will be able to be back inside Fenway, rubbing elbows again, even if we're wearing a mask, whatever, small price to pay for being back into some of these places that have been closed up. So we are back where we started, back in Boston, safe at home, having had our New England road trip. Didn't have to wear a mask, didn't have to spend any money on gas. So as I finish up, I will invite Erin to come back in and help us moderate the questions and answers. And I'm going to leave up, if you're interested in any of my books, here you go. So here are all three of my books. And if you go on my website, tedreinstein.com, you will be able to purchase any of my books and hopefully hold on to them. And when you see me next at one of the libraries that we're talking about tonight, that have joined in tonight, I'll be happy to sign for you. So with that, thank you very much. And I will turn things back over to Erin.
Wonderful. If you guys have any questions for Ted, you can type them into the chat feature at the bottom of your screen. I see that we have a lot of great comments for other pizza suggestions in New Haven and stories
Not surprised.
of mourning the old man on the mountain when he fell.
Yeah.
But if you guys have any questions, please type them in there.
Well, how great too that 4 different libraries came together tonight to make this talk happen. That's really wonderful. It's funny, I've had that experience now. I've been doing these virtual talks since the summer, and I've had that experience a few times now where libraries have collaborated to come together to make some of these talks happen, which is great. So great.
It's been wonderful to be able to collaborate with our neighboring libraries, especially now that geography is not so in the way anymore.
Right, right.
Really
and all 4 of those libraries, as I said earlier, I've spoken at every single one. So I know them all.
See, we do have a question. What is the best beach in Maine?
Wow. What is the best beach in Maine? There are so many. Here's the thing. Here's the thing about beaches and Maine. The water in Maine, oddly enough, is not conducive for a lot of swimming. I have some favorite beaches. I love the beaches in there's a small beach in Bar Harbor. I love, Mount Desert Island. I even love in southern Maine, Scarborough. But here's the thing. You can't stay in the water for very long, no matter what beach you are on in Maine. So I just say, look, if you're going up to Maine and you want to spend the day at the beach, that's great. You're not going to spend a whole lot of time in the water. If what you really want to do is swim, you might want to go somewhere else. But listen, a day in Maine is never a bad day. So whether or not you spend hours in the water, who cares? It's a great place to go. Great place to go. Anyone else?
Yes, we have a question. Are you working on another book?
I am, and thank you for asking. I am. So my fourth book is actually at the publisher now, and it is scheduled to be released, knock on wood, in September, next September. And the book is called Before Brooklyn: The Unsung Heroes Who Helped Break Baseball's Color Barrier. So this is the first book I've done that is not really centered in New England, although there are some local angles to it for sure. But it's really a look at how 60 years from the time the color barrier was set up in baseball to when Jackie Robinson broke the color barrier in 1947. I always felt I love Jackie Robinson, always been a lifelong hero. But the more I learned about the various people and organizations, from the black newspapers to Pullman porters to Negro League players, the more I learned about how many people there were that tried so hard to integrate baseball and to at least lay the groundwork for Jackie Robinson, but are not known, are really largely unknown. I really felt like I wanted to tell their story. So that's what this is. This is the story of the people who really lay the groundwork for Jackie Robinson to finally break the barrier. And that's what it's about. And I hope that I will be able to share that with you too next fall, hopefully in person. But thank you
Yes,
for asking.
excellent. We'll look forward to that. Do you have a favorite half-day trip from Boston?
A favorite half-day trip from Boston? That's a good question. So certainly is going to rule out Bar Harbor. Um, you know, depending on the time of year, um, I love to hike. There are some wonderful hikes that you can easily do half a day. Here's a great half-day trip, and this is a place I just found. Um, just was introduced to me this past fall. So if you go up into southern New Hampshire, right, very southern, Nashua, it's only going to take you even less than an hour, depending where you are in Eastern Mass, right? Certainly from Wilmington, North Andover, Tewksbury, way less than like 40 minutes, 30 minutes less. If you go to Nashua and you go west from there, about 30 minutes more, you come to Milford, New Hampshire, right? Just past there, just past there, there is state forest, a state forest. Sure. Oh my God, I can't believe I'm blanking. It's not Sherwood. It's not Sherlock. Uh, I think it is the Sherwood State Forest. It is Sherwood State Forest. That is an incredible place because it has a huge number of old growth trees, right? So all over, especially southern New England, all the trees that you see in the woods are not original trees because New England was largely forested for its timber, both for ships' masts and for heat, right? Firewood. So this forest is unique in that there's a lot of old growth, which means that some of these trees make you think of almost like redwoods. They're not that tall, but they're tall, taller than anything you're used to seeing in New England. Some of them are 300-400 feet high, which is really tall. And now it is open to the public. It is a preserved forest, right, by the Nature Conservancy, which owns it today. So you can park there, the little parking place, and you can hike into the woods and you see these mammoth trees and it's quiet. And as you drive back home, you can't believe that you're only 30 minutes from the sprawl of Nashua, New Hampshire. Easy day trip. Stop in Milford, have lunch at the Riverside Cafe, great sandwiches, and take time out to go to Centennial Park in Milford, where you will find the statue of Harriet E. Wilson, another New Englander I did not know existed until I took this trip this fall. Harriet E. Wilson is unique in that she is the first African-American woman to have a novel published in North America in 1859. So easily done in a nice, I've kind of just described tending toward a full day, but you can do the bulk of that in half a day. Go for it. It's a great trip. Give yourself the whole day, right? That's my suggestion.
I definitely second the sandwiches at the Riverside Cafe. They are delicious.
You've been there.
I have family in Milford.
Oh, there you go. There you go.
Let's see. What are your 3 favorite clam shacks in Maine?
Oh. My 3 favorite clam shacks in Maine. Well, it should come as no surprise to you that if the clam chowder at the Granite Trading Company is my favorite clam chowder, I pretty much like the clams there too. So I'm going to go with Buttermilk Cove and the Granite Trading Company. I'm going to go with Red's Eats in Wiscasset, right? So just before you go over the causeway between Wiscasset and head up toward Waldoboro, Red's Eats, which is, you may or may not know, is a long time little trailer, right? Not even a brick and mortar place. Red's Eats makes a fantastic clam roll. And you know what? I also really, really like both the lobster roll and the clam roll at the Maine Diner. At the Maine Diner in Wells, Maine. So there are my picks. I'm sticking with them.
All right, excellent. We have a lot of food questions, which I'm sure is no surprise.
Okay. Mind you, I haven't had dinner yet, so easy on the food questions.
Your favorite barbecue restaurant?
Oh, that's a hard one. That's a really hard one. I'm blanking on the name of this place that I've been in, but just outside of Concord, New Hampshire, and I believe it's on off of Route 89. Sometimes these places start to blur together for me. However, I also have a favorite barbecue. Is it Jay's? Which, believe it or not, is in a most unlikely barbecue setting in Revere, Massachusetts. He used to have a place. He used to have a place in Chelsea, and then he closed that. And then it's right off of Revere Beach. I was just there. It's on 1A on Ocean Road, and I was just there this summer. So it's terrible. I'm blanking on for sure both places. I can see them in my mind's eye, so I apologize. Sometimes the places just blur for me, and I can't recall them all. We went from clams to barbecue in the space of 30 seconds, and I'm blanking. So, next question.
I think that's fair. Let's see. Oh, one question about one of your destinations on the road trip tonight, Pemaquid Point. I hope I'm not mispronouncing that.
That's right.
Can you walk along the rocks there? Is it an easy
Absolutely.
walk?
Absolutely. So those striated rocks at Pemaquid Point are fascinating. Fascinating. Here's the thing, and there's lots of signage there to warn you if you haven't been there before. Pemaquid Point can be dangerous down behind the lighthouse on the rocks. First of all, if the tide is just coming in or just going out, it's very slippery. So be super careful. The best time is to check the tide and make sure that the tide is out, because that gives you the largest area to walk along the rocks, and the rocks have had a chance to dry out a little bit. So it's less dangerous, especially if you're there with kids. It really can be kind of a dangerous place. But if you get there when the tide is out, especially if the sun is out, the rocks will be dry, and then it absolutely open to the public. Walk at will. I think they do close the gate to getting toward the lighthouse after dark, but if you've never been, it's a fantastic place to check out. It really is. And you pronounced it perfectly, Erin.
Oh, good. I always worry. One question was if this will be available to view, so you can look back and see the destinations. And we are recording this, so it will be on the Wilmington Memorial Library Facebook page.
Great.
If you want to look back for a reminder, any of the destinations tonight.
Mm-hmm.
Let's see. I did have a couple more questions.
Yeah.
Some of your favorite restaurants in Boston.
Some of my favorite restaurants in Boston. So I'm going to tell you one thing right off the bat. I don't eat out in Boston like I used to. So, especially, my younger days, I did often. But the restaurant scene, as you know, has changed so much over the last 10 years, never mind the last 20 years. So I honestly do not eat out that often in Boston. I still have some wonderful Italian restaurants that are still around. Lucia's in the North End. Piccolo Venezia on Salem Street is still there. But, I just don't have a lot of other, and some of the ones that I love so much are now gone, which is just, crushing. But I am frankly not the best guy to ask when it comes to favorite restaurants in Boston. I just don't go in often enough to be the best person to ask. Sorry.
It is certainly a scene that's always changing. Favorite biking trail in New England?
Oh, okay. That I have some ideas. So I love biking trails. My love of biking and trails around New England is one particular kind of biking trails. What I really love are rail trails, right? And if you if you know, these are biking trails which are also open to, you can walk, you can rollerblade it usually, you can jog, but these are biking trails that have been essentially recycled from former rail lines, right? And it is a growing phenomenon in America. It began about 40 years ago. And I have biked on coast to coast. I have biked in bike trails all over America, but I have biked from Western Mass all the way out through the Cape on a number of Massachusetts has some wonderful rail trails. And again, what I love about them is that they are recycled, right? So this is often wonderfully scenic areas that at one time were only enjoyed by someone who was, and they were often freight lines. So they were only enjoyed by the crew of a train. And now they can be enjoyed by everybody. If you want to start in the Berkshires, I think two of the most beautiful biking rail trails in Massachusetts, one of them is the Ashwiltacook Trail. So that's out in the Berkshires, right? Goes by water, goes by woods, beautiful, beautiful trail, some lovely places to stop and get an ice cream on the way. All the way on the other part of the state, as you probably know, the Shining Sea Trail, Massachusetts' first rail trail, and still one of its most scenic. It's the only rail trail in Massachusetts that runs directly along a beach, and it runs through Falmouth and Woods Hole. So the Shining Sea is wonderful, but there are others in Central Mass that are beautiful, wonderful rail trails. The Nashua River Rail Trail is another one. It's just there are some great rail trails. And the North Shore, closer to Wilmington and these four towns. There's a wonderful rail trail that runs through a salt marsh up by Salisbury, right? That's a wonderful rail trail. Right in Boston, right all the way into the city itself. The Neponset Rail Trail rings right around the harbor and runs past, the Kennedy Library. So all kinds of great variation. You get great variety. You got, you can be on rail trails and bike in Massachusetts through woods, by the ocean, right into the city and the urban area. Great question. I'm glad you asked me because I love to expound on rail trails almost as much as I love to expound on public libraries.
Excellent. All right. I think.
We good?
I think so.
All
One
right.
last one looks like we have, do you have a go-to item that you look for when you visit a general store?
Do I have a go-to item that I look for when I go to a general store? So first of all, you should know that I love general stores so much that if it's an authentic general store, which doesn't just mean old and just doesn't mean it looks a certain way, it means that it's a third place, like public libraries, right? It means it's a place where community gathers. It's a place where people who live in that town are likely to be there too. They're likely to go in and get a cup of coffee. I'm never really going in to buy something so much as if it's a place I've never been, I'm going in to check it out. I will buy something. I'll buy food, a coffee, a sandwich. But mostly I'm going in just to check it out. Now, there are general stores that I'm more familiar with that I know that they do something, right? That they have great licorice or they have an authentic porcelain pickle barrel. So I'll get pickles there. I know that they make a great BLT like the Harrisville in Harrisville, New Hampshire. So that's true. Those will be certain things that I'll look for. General stores that I'm familiar with, but more than anything, I'm just going in to love a general store. I'm just going in to give some love to a general store.
Wonderful. Excellent. Oh, and one question referring to motif number one.
Mm.
They asked if you know when it was the original motif number one was destroyed.
The original motif number one was destroyed in the blizzard of 1978, if I'm not mistaken. Came down in the blizzard in 1978 and was rebuilt. So the one you see today, you're correct, is not the original. But I believe it came down in the blizzard of 78.
All right. And it looks like one more question, if you don't mind.
No.
What comes to mind when you hear food in Bar Harbor? So I think, do you have any restaurants favorites in Bar Harbor?
The short answer is no. The reason is Bar Harbor, I spent an entire summer there, but I was 21 years old. So what I remember from them would be meaningless. I have not gone out to eat in Bar Harbor in 15 years. So I know there are some longtime places there. But I know a lot of things about New England. I can't claim to be an expert on every single corner. So I'm not gonna pretend that I have a favorite place to eat in Bar Harbor. I don't. I have lots of other favorite places to eat all throughout Maine, but Bar Harbor just isn't one of them. I'm sorry.
I think that's quite all right. Oh, we do have confirmation in the chat that motif number one was destroyed in the blizzard of 78 and the replica was constructed that same year. So they had a quick turnaround.
There you go.
And we certainly have tons of comments thanking you for this program, Ted.
My pleasure. I had a great time. Thank you. First of all, thank you, Erin, for your great help tonight. And thank you to all of the libraries that were part of this tonight, both Wilmington and North Andover, Erin, Tewksbury, Reading. I really appreciate it. I really appreciate the support. And thank you, everybody who came out and joined us tonight. I really appreciate it. And I mean it when I tell you that I really hope that I will see all of you in person sometime starting next fall when I start coming out to talk about my new book.
Yes, we hope to have you back in the libraries again.
Definitely.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you all so much. Thanks, everybody. Have a good night. Be safe.
Have a good one.
Bye-bye now.